Welcome back, everyone, to another reaction video. Well, if you didn't already know, we had a recent election here in the United States, and Donald Trump became the second president in American history to be elected to non-consecutive terms, meaning that though he will be the 47th president, we have only had 45 people who have held the office of president. Grover Cleveland was the 22nd and 24th, and now Donald Trump the 45th and 47th. That's just kind of how we do things with the numbering system when you have non-consecutive terms. And so I stumbled upon this video by a channel called Stuff That Happened. He's got not quite 6,300 subscribers, so fairly small channel, but hopefully we like what we see and we can maybe shine a little light on him and get him some more exposure. This is called Grover Cleveland, Parallels with Donald Trump's Historic 2024 Victory. So I haven't watched the video and I haven't watched anything from this channel yet, but it's going to apparently explore the parallels between these two men who now share something in common that no other presidents in American history have had. So I'll put the link in the description so you can check it out without my commentary, as well as check out all the other videos that Stuff That Happened has to offer. Let's dive into this one.
Once upon a time, an extremely larger-than-life and popular figure quickly rose up the political ladder to become a candidate for the President of the United States. He won the election despite vicious attacks from the opposition, served 4 years as president, succeeding in foreign affairs, avoiding wars, while reducing corruption from within. But he lost in the next election, with the opposition promising better times for all Americans. Instead, prices rose and the economy tanked. So Americans voted to bring back the previous president, who won both the popular vote and the Electoral College, and went on to serve 2 non-consecutive terms. Of course, I'm talking about Grover Cleveland.
Both had a Indiana vice president their first term,
who served as both the 22nd president of the United States and the 24th. For over 130 years, he was the only president to serve non-consecutive terms. But after the most recent presidential election, the country is about to experience this event once again, as Donald Trump was voted in as the 47th president after already serving as the 45th, becoming the second ever president to serve non-consecutive terms. And, as you may have noticed, their stories align in many ways. Although it remains to be seen how well President Trump will govern the nation from the Oval Office during his second term, we do know how well it went for President Grover Cleveland.
So my first observation about this is that, yeah, there definitely seem to be some parallels between the two beyond just the non-consecutive term thing. But I find myself wondering, if we looked for parallels between any two presidents, we could probably find a number of factors that would make it sound like, wow, there's a lot of parallels between these two guys. So is it that there are that many parallels, or is it really that we're highlighting parallels that could likewise exist between any two given presidents?
And today we'll look back at both of his terms, as well as what went on in the middle during the presidency of Benjamin Harrison. You might be shocked to see just how similar the 2 points in time are as we look back at the executive branch from 1885 to 1897, the last time an individual served as president for 2 discontinuous terms. Although there were many differences, for instance, Cleveland was a Democrat and Trump a Republican.
Yeah, and Cleveland was a Democrat at a time when Democrats just simply didn't get elected president. From 1868, the election in which Ulysses S. Grant was elected. Let's go back. Let's go back to 1860 when Abraham Lincoln was elected. So you have 60 and 64 and 68. So from 1860, when Abraham Lincoln is the first Republican elected president, until 1912, when you have Woodrow Wilson win because of a split in the Republican vote between Theodore Roosevelt and William Howard Taft, you have one Democrat in that 52-year period that gets elected president, and it's Grover Cleveland.
It is amazing just how many parallels there are.
Good evening, my fellow citizens.
We will be able to work together, to pray together.
If the Japanese insist on continuing resistance, their country will suffer the same destruction as Germany.
I like the intro music.
Was arrested by local authorities.
8 climbers dead.
Grover Cleveland was born in Caldwell, New Jersey on March 18th, 1837.
I don't think I've ever seen this picture of Grover Cleveland. He's a good-looking dude. Got a full beard going on, that nice big thick hair. Well, good for him. And he's slim there, too. You know, a lot of people, when we think of, like, really robust presidents, we think of William Howard Taft. But Grover Cleveland was almost as big as Taft. I mean, he was pushing 300 pounds at one point.
Anne and Richard Cleveland. Richard was a pastor.
That is not Richard Cleveland. That's a photo of some dude from the 20th century. That is definitely not Grover Cleveland's dad.
Passed away in 1853 when Grover was 16 years old, forcing him to abandon school in order to help support his mother and younger sisters.
Did I say 19? I don't remember if I said 19th or 20th century. That was definitely a 20th century picture.
He became a clerk at a law firm, and as he gained experience, he became more and more interested in the law and was admitted to the New York bar in 1859 at 22 years of age. By 1862, he had begun his own practice, but it was around this time the Civil War broke out. Although Cleveland was still young and able-bodied, he was able to pay $150 to a Polish immigrant to serve in his place, avoiding active service in order to care for his mother and continue to work as an assistant district attorney.
Now that sounds kind of bad, right? You know, you paid someone else to serve for you, but that's the system the government set up. The United States and the Confederate States, for that matter, both introduced a draft during the American Civil War. And it wasn't nearly as extensive as the drafts that would come later, for example, in World War II, World War I and World War II in Vietnam. But there was a draft. And yeah, you could pay, it was usually more than 150, a lot of times it was 300, for somebody else to go in your place. And that was a common thing that happened. And a lot of these substitutes end up joining late in the war. So they didn't die in huge numbers the way that people did earlier in the war, because a lot of these substitutes that are being paid for are coming in late 1864, early 65. But this was not uncommon. But you can see how that could be something that would be a point of criticism for Grover Cleveland, especially in a stretch when pretty much every president was a Republican from Ohio who served in the Civil War, most of them generals.
This would be something his political opponents would use against him later in life, a similar tactic that has been seen used against Donald Trump in the fact that he was able to avoid getting drafted during Vietnam. And
only recently has non-military service been a pretty standard thing for presidents. I mean, Trump, Biden, Obama, George W. Bush served. Trump, Biden, and Obama. Bill Clinton did not serve in the military. But if you go back through history, it's pretty rare to have a president who did not serve in the military until recently.
Cleveland continued to work in law and became interested in politics in the 1860s. He ran for sheriff of Erie County as a Democrat in 1870 and was elected.
Erie County is Buffalo, so it's western New York. It's also where Millard Fillmore is from. He's buried there. William McKinley was assassinated there.
He served 3 relatively unremarkable years as sheriff, although citizens considered him fair and efficient. His career as a lawyer had some ups and downs, but nothing spectacular.
He hanged people.
1880, just 5 years before he would become president, no one could have possibly predicted the meteoric rise that was about to take place in the life and career of Grover Cleveland. He was just a local lawyer and ex-county sheriff with a tiny bit of political experience.
Yeah, and I see a lot of parallels between him and another New York president, Theodore Roosevelt. Theodore Roosevelt, in a really short time, I mean, he serves for quite a while in the New York State Assembly, but then if you look in the late 1890s, in the span of like less than 5 years, he goes from Assistant Secretary of the Navy, war hero, Governor of New York, Vice President, President, all in the span of less than 5 years. Grover Cleveland does something similar.
But then, in 1881, he was nominated for mayor of Buffalo, New York, by local Democrats who discussed him favorably in meetings, remembering his time as sheriff. Cleveland was...
Wait, I want to pause and read this for a second here. This article, Grover Cleveland is a thrifty soul and easily proven by his record as a hangman. Yeah, he did hang people. We've had presidents who have personally ended the lives of other people. Andrew Jackson killed a guy in a duel. He fought a lot of duels for that matter. And certainly we've had people in the military who have been responsible for the deaths of others, but not really executioners. It appears that in the 2 cases in which he acted in that capacity, he actually pulled the lever himself by which the wretches made the fatal drop. In the one case, he charged and received $500, and in the other $650 for his services, though he might have hired a blackguard to have done the dirty job for $10 or less. But Grover preferred to save his pittance and glide down through the ages with the stain of a common executioner on his name and the brand of Cain on his soul. So Cain, Old Testament firstborn child of Adam and Eve, murders his brother Abel.
Was surprised by the nomination but accepted it, and shockingly won the election, becoming mayor. He dedicated himself to cleaning up the streets and stopping corruption within local government, and results were quickly produced as Cleveland worked longer and harder hours than any mayor that people had remembered. They were impressed not only with his ability to govern, but also by his intimidating physical stature at 280 pounds.
Big dude.
His popularity quickly soared, and he was nominated as governor of New York. After winning the election, Cleveland continued to clean up corruption, which improved his popularity with the people, but also created enemies within Tammany Hall, a New York City political machine that served as an engine for political corruption.
So there are certain time periods in history when there are issues that dominate politics across multiple generations or multiple presidencies. And, today, for example, we have immigration, which has been an ongoing issue of discussion. And for many people, kind of their main issue for voting. If you look at the polls from this last election, the economy and immigration are 2 of the biggest issues. At that time, corruption is one of the biggest issues, and it has been for several presidents by this point. At this point, the federal government, its main source of revenue is through tariffs, and more of those tariffs are being collected in the Port of New York than anywhere else. And so the Port of New York is a powerful government position that is appointed by the person who's elected president. There's something known as the spoils system. You get elected president, you get the spoils of winning, which means you get to appoint people. And a lot of times it's political cronies. And so Tammany Hall is this Democrat political machine in New York City that dominates the politics of the city, but also in many ways national politics. It has a lot of influence. And so, for example, when James Garfield is elected, his vice president is Chester Arthur, who is seen as a product of that corrupt Tammany Hall political machine, even though he's a Republican. And he ends up being one of the people who helped stamp that out, even though he was a product of it. And so Grover Cleveland is also elected during a time when Tammany Hall and corruption and the spoils system is a dominant political issue.
The machine tried its best to turn the people against Grover Cleveland, but Americans were fed up with scandals and corruption and turned their support towards Cleveland.
And it wasn't just New York. You have things like the Credit Mobilier scandal. You have a lot of corruption going on with Expansion West and people trying to make money off the railroads and off of government jobs and purchases that are happening. All kinds of corruption. Ulysses S. Grant's administration was seen as very corrupt, though he personally was not corrupt. It was a lot of people in his administration. So this is definitely one of those dominant issues, and Cleveland is probably one of the people who is seen as having dealt with it the best.
To the point that he was now in discussions as the possible 1884 Democratic nominee for President of the United States. The president at the time, Republican Chester A. Arthur, had become president after James A. Garfield's assassination and was completing what would have been Garfield's term. Garfield, like Cleveland, was committed to ending corruption in Washington, but never got the chance as he was assassinated shortly into his presidency. Arthur, after completing his term, in which he didn't really fight corruption as Garfield had planned to.
I don't know if I completely agree with that. I think Arthur did a lot more to fight corruption than people expected him to do, considering they saw him as a product of it. So that might be a little unfair to say that he didn't really do anything about it.
Chose to not seriously seek re-election as he was suffering from poor health and was unlikely to win anyway. So the Republicans put out former Speaker of the House, James G. Blaine, as their new candidate. Blaine was a strong candidate in 1880 but fell short to Garfield in the Republican National Convention, but he attracted nationwide support, arguing for the gold standard and civil rights for freed black men. However, he also had a reputation as a corrupt politician, and this was the driving force when the Democrats nominated Cleveland as their candidate.
There are times when people become very much single issue voters. When there's a dominant issue in politics, it doesn't much matter what your stance is on 90% of things. People are going to focus on the thing that matters to them. And a great example of that is this year's election. It doesn't much matter what people thought of Donald Trump and Kamala Harris as candidates. For many people, their view was that the economy wasn't doing well. And when the economy's not doing well, the incumbent party is held responsible for it, rightly or wrongly. You know, we can make arguments about whether or not the president really has that much of an impact on the economy, but whether he does or doesn't, they get held responsible for it. And in this case, corruption is such a major issue for so many voters that if you have two candidates, one is seen as being tough on and cleaning up corruption, and the other one is seen as being connected to that corruption, it doesn't matter how you feel about pretty much anything else to do with those candidates if that's the main issue that you're voting on.
Although the figure of speech "drain the swamp" didn't exist back then, that was effectively what Cleveland was elected to do for the country, just as he had done at the city, county, and state level. Mudslinging and personal attacks defined the 1884 election. It was discovered that Cleveland had a relationship with a woman years back and fathered a child out of wedlock.
Mama, where's my paw? I mean, they had like slogans and songs and everything to try and just instill in the mind of the voters that Grover Cleveland is a deadbeat dad who had a child out of wedlock. And that's the kind of an issue that would stick even today. But imagine how much more of an issue that was for people in 1884. But he was able to overcome that.
He was attacked hard for this, and there were even accusations that he had raped the woman.
Yes.
An accusation that was never proven, and he admitted that he and the woman had a consensual relationship and that she had a child, and that he paid child support even though he wasn't certain the child was his.
Yeah, and I mean, this is one of those things that whether it's true or not, accusations like that will stick in the minds of people. Sometimes all it takes is the accusation. We see that today in a world in which we've so often seen the cancel culture. As soon as the accusation is thrown out, whether it's true or not becomes secondary. And by the time we find out maybe that it's not true, it's already done the damage.
Instead of losing voters, he gained support by his apparent honesty and continuous demands for the truth above all else, and elimination of all corruption and dishonesty within the government. The election was close, but Grover Cleveland was victorious, mainly due to securing New York State, which he won by less than 1,200 votes. He was the first Democrat elected U.S. president since before the Civil War.
Yeah, since 1856 with James Buchanan. And yeah, I mean, 1,200 votes. You don't think your vote matters? 1,200 votes swung the largest state in terms of electoral votes at that time. New York is the big powerhouse. It's the California of the day, but it's often a swing state at that time. And so New York, again, that's why New York politics are so powerful, because there's so much riding on it.
His vice president was former Indiana Governor Thomas A. Hendricks, but Hendricks passed away of a heart attack shortly into the term and was not replaced.
There was no system for replacing the vice president. That didn't exist until you get to the 1970s, and you have an amendment to the Constitution that allows for that, and that's very soon after you get Gerald Ford being appointed as vice president, who then becomes president when Nixon resigns.
22nd President of the United States, Grover Cleveland continued to work day and night to accomplish his goals. He nullified fraudulent grants, vetoed unlawful bills,
a lot of vetoes,
rejected corrupt measures,
hundreds of
continued
vetoes,
to improve his popularity with the people by being an actual, honest politician who cared about the American people. He vetoed over 400 bills, more than any other previous president.
He's definitely one of those presidents that, I mean, who would be very much a conservative today. He's about limiting the power and scope of the government. That was something that he did a lot of. limiting the influence of corrupt individuals within the government. I guess you could argue it is, like he said, the draining of the swamp. Cleveland also has something else that sets him apart with a few other presidents in that he went by his middle name. His name was Stephen Grover Cleveland. You had John Calvin Coolidge. You had Ulysses S. Grant, who was originally born Hiram Ulysses Grant. Thomas Woodrow Wilson. You've got a lot of presidents who were juniors, like that didn't really go by that. But and then you have a lot of presidents who even have different last names. Well, a couple. You have William Jefferson Blythe III, who became Bill Clinton. Leslie Lynch King, who is Gerald Ford. Just kind of a cool little fun fact I always thought was interesting about Cleveland.
He shocked the system almost right away by not immediately firing most of his cabinet members.
That is unusual.
Like most presidents had done, bringing in their own people. Instead, if they were doing a good job, even if they were Republican, he allowed them to keep their job. No job was appointed based on the party of an individual, only on the person's ability to perform the job. At the same time, he would not hesitate to fire a Democrat if they could not do the job or if he smelt a whiff of corruption. During Cleveland's first term, he helped enact the Interstate Commerce Commission, which would regulate railroads, eliminate rate discrimination, and keep rates fair for all people concerning not just railroad travel, but also bus lines. Another major act passed during his first term that's not looked back on as favorably was the Dawes General Allotment Act.
Yeah, so let's talk about the railroad stuff for a minute. Again, talking about corruption, a lot of the corruption centered around the railroads. The railroads have been throughout the last couple presidencies getting huge government deals where they were buying up all kinds of land out west. A lot of it Native American land, which is fueling the westward expansion and people moving to all this land that's been opened up and made available. But of course, that means you've got to remove people who are living on that land, and that so you have, again, Native Americans get screwed in all of it.
Which allowed the U.S. federal government to divide reservation land held by Native American tribes into smaller plots and distribute them to individuals and small families. This aimed to assimilate them into mainstream American society by encouraging farming and individual land ownership. To break down all the ins and outs of the Dawes Act would require its own video, but while it did help some Native Americans who could now buy and sell land more freely, as a whole, it was also harmful to Native American sovereignty, culture, and identity. Cleveland was also not too successful when it comes to civil rights, as at this point in time, 20 years had passed since the Civil War, and it had been many years since the passing of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments that freed the slaves, granted citizenship to all born in the U.S., and allowed black men to vote. But attempts to enforce these civil rights laws had utterly failed.
Yeah, public sentiment toward Reconstruction had long since waned, which is unfortunate because a lot of people just were tired of it. They were tired of the Civil War and the aftermath of the Civil War, and whites, especially in the North, just wanted to stop dealing with it. And they basically abandoned what we call freedmen to their fate and to 100 years plus of segregation and Jim Crow laws and really treatment as second-class citizens for blacks in the South especially, but in the North too.
Years prior, the 18th president, Ulysses S. Grant, tried in vain to transform the country into one where every person was truly free. But all of his enforcement acts and attempts to outlaw racial discrimination failed in actual practice. 1,000,000 laws could not take away the prejudice inside of many people, along with their sense of entitlement to cheap black labor.
Yep.
With this in mind, Cleveland hesitated to use federal power to enforce civil rights laws and considered Reconstruction a complete failure.
Yeah, and it kind of was. I mean, and again, this goes to Cleveland being somebody who's more of government hands-off type of guy. And unfortunately, there are times when the government needed to step in and protect the civil rights of people, and he failed to do that, just like a lot of presidents did.
His foreign policy was to not be too ambitious and to not get involved in foreign conflicts if at all possible. He opposed territorial expansion and squashed a proposal that would have allowed the United States to build a canal through Nicaragua to connect to the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. He also withdrew a proposed treaty that would have expanded U.S. interests in the Congo. When foreign affairs occurred that he had to involve himself in, Cleveland moved with caution and tactfulness. For example, after Canadian authorities seized U.S. fishing boats for fishing in the North Atlantic, war with Canada seemed a distinct possibility.
I mean, these are some of the same types of things that led to the War of 1812. A foreign government seizing property, seizing boats, seizing sailors. And the U.S., remember, has had its eye on Canada for 100 years, thinking of ways to gobble up that territory or to free it from Britain.
Especially after the U.S. retaliated by capturing Canadian fishing vessels off the coast of Alaska. Cleveland helped to negotiate a treaty avoiding war and easing tensions over fishing rights. Although he avoided wars and major conflicts, he still did all he could to ensure the military continued to modernize and was prepared at all times to defend. Cleveland, who entered the White House as a bachelor, got married during his first term to 21-year-old Frances Folsom, who turned out to be a very popular first lady.
Yeah, let's talk about Frances, though. Frances's father was a law partner of Grover Cleveland, and when her father died when she was 10, 11, 12 years old, Cleveland raised her after that, and then he married her 10 years later.
She was very open to the public and personally welcomed visitors to the White House. Her warmth and popularity only helped President Cleveland, who seemed like a people's president, destined for a second term. He was renominated.
And they had a child named Ruth, who years later it was claimed was the inspiration for the candy bar Baby Ruth, but that was a way to get around having used the name of Babe Ruth, which was the real reason why the candy bar was named that. People retroactively claimed it was about her. It wasn't.
Unanimous fashion at the Democratic Convention and selected Allen G. Thurman of Ohio to be his running mate for a second term. The Republicans nominated a former U.S. Senator from Indiana, Benjamin Harrison. While campaigning, Harrison began to gain momentum with aggressive fundraising and attacks against Cleveland's tariff policy. Cleveland was for lower tariffs, which would result in lower prices for consumers, while Harrison argued for a high tariff, which would be better for industrialism in general, resulting in higher profits, higher wages, and an overall better economy. On Election Day, Grover Cleveland narrowly won the popular vote, but lost the key swing states of New York and Indiana. Benjamin Harrison won the Electoral College and thus the election of 1888. The grandson of former President William Henry Harrison, Benjamin Harrison was sworn in as the 23rd President of the United States. The Ohio native served as a colonel in the Civil War and fought in multiple key battles before a promotion to brigadier general. He was elected to the U.S. Senate, representing the state of Indiana, and became a major leader in the Republican Party.
Yeah, Harrison's one of these multiple presidents that we've had that can kind of be claimed by two states. He's born in Ohio. His grandfather was elected from Ohio, but born in Virginia, so he gets claimed by two as well. Harrison's buried in Indianapolis. He's a senator from Indiana. Very rare to see senators at this time getting elected president, but a lot of presidents have been claimed by two states. Joe Biden claimed by Delaware, because that's where he lived most of his adult life and where he served from as a senator, but was born in northeastern Pennsylvania. Barack Obama, born in Hawaii, elected from Illinois. Abraham Lincoln, born in Kentucky, elected from Illinois. A lot of presidents are like that.
Like Cleveland, he also continued to favor the merit system, in which jobs were given to those best qualified, regardless of political affiliation. But his presidency turned out to be a mixed bag, with some positives like the Land Revision Act of 1891, which established national forests, and his admission of 6 new states to the Union, more than any other president. Yeah. However, his economic policies set the country on a path towards financial disaster.
And interesting, you see here, again, just even though New York is the biggest state in terms of electoral votes, Ohio's got so much influence at this time. Look at right here. You've got Benjamin Harrison, born and raised in Ohio. What are key economic legislations here? McKinley Tariff. William McKinley is a congressman at this time from Ohio, later elected governor of Ohio. Sherman Antitrust Act. John Sherman, brother of William Tecumseh Sherman, the general. John Sherman's a senator from Ohio.
The high tariffs that he said would help the economy and improve wages were not showing the intended results, and federal spending reached $1 billion for the first time in U.S. history during his term. The McKinley Tariff, which was designed to protect domestic workers from foreign competition, became law during Harrison's presidency. Grover Cleveland deplored the tariff, which increased the tax rate on foreign products by nearly 50% and caused the price of goods to dramatically increase. The Sherman Silver Purchase Act was also passed under Harrison, and it required the government to buy a certain amount of silver per month, diminishing the gold reserves. It caused inflation to accelerate even faster and was another factor in an upcoming economic panic. By the time Harrison's first term was coming to an end, the people of the United States were fed up with rising prices and a crumbling economy. Possibly another parallel with the end of Joe Biden's term.
Yep. It's the economy, stupid. That was the big mantra when Bill Clinton was elected president.
He regretted not voting for the previous president. In this case, it was Grover Cleveland. And as fate would have it, he decided to run for president again, alongside new running mate Adlai Stevenson. And they soundly defeated Harrison, this time winning Cleveland's home state of New York. He won both the popular vote and the Electoral College, becoming the first president to ever serve non-consecutive terms. So at this point, history meets up with the present day, and some of the parallels are amazing. A tanking economy and broken promises led to the election of a president who spent 4 years on the sidelines and returned to the office to try and undo some of the damage done in the previous 4 years. We don't know how President Trump will do in the present day, but we can look back and see how things went for President Cleveland in his second term. Unfortunately, the economy was on the verge of total collapse.
And here's the thing. A lot of presidents, non-consecutive or otherwise, tend to be more popular in their first term than they are in their second term. And Grover Cleveland's no exception. Honestly, Grover Cleveland probably ends up ranking much higher as a president if he hadn't been reelected to a second term.
And Cleveland did not have time to repair it, as the panic of 1893 struck the stock market just as Cleveland's second term began. It was the most severe depression in United States history at the time and would not be matched until the Great Depression. So
in fact, this depression was called the Great Depression until the Great Depression.
Cleveland was kept very busy throughout his second term, just attempting to restore a broken economy during a financial panic. The shortage of gold due to the Sherman Silver Purchase Act made things worse, and Cleveland called a special session to support the repeal of the act, and he eventually succeeded, which was the beginning of the end for silver as a basis for American currency. He also tried to reverse the damage done by the McKinley Tariff with the Revenue Act, also known as the Wilson-Gorman Tariff.
And ironically, Cleveland would be succeeded as president by William McKinley.
Would reduce tariff rates. The bill went through several changes, and Cleveland was furious with the amendments and nullifications, but allowed the bill to go through anyway without his signature, as it was still an improvement over the McKinley Tariff. Despite his efforts, Cleveland was widely blamed for the panic, as thousands of businesses closed their doors and over 500 banks closed.
So you might be wondering, well, why did he allow the bill to go through without his signature? Well, as you learn in civics class when you're growing up in the U.S., and I'm hoping they still teach these kinds of things, when a bill is passed by Congress, the president has three options. He can sign it into law. He can veto it, send it back to Congress, who then has an opportunity to try and override the presidential veto with a 2/3 majority, or he can let it go and it becomes law after a certain time period has passed without his signature. In other words, I'm not going to veto it, or vetoing won't matter because the votes aren't there to, the votes are there to override my veto, making it pointless for me to veto, or I can allow it, which means I'm not kind of giving my approval to it, but I'm also not rejecting it.
Unemployment was close to 50% in some states, and people were starving around the country. Cleveland did experience a few positives during his second term, including the continued modernization of the military, the statehood of Utah, and an effective foreign policy, but the Depression overshadowed those accomplishments. One of the biggest disasters of his second term came from major strikes by railroaders, known as the Pullman Strike, a widespread railroad strike and boycott that disrupted rail traffic in the Midwest. The strike was becoming violent, with fire being set and locomotives being derailed, some attached to U.S. mail trains. A federal injunction was issued allowing Cleveland to order the Army to stop the strikers from obstructing trains so that mail could be delivered. This led to even more violence and eventually the dissolution of the American Railway Union.
Yeah, this is one of those situations where it's a no-win scenario for the president, right? If you do nothing, it's disrupting the economy and the working of the country to the point where things are grinding to a standstill. I mean, think about that. If something similar happened with Ronald Reagan, where you have a strike of the air traffic controllers, and Reagan says you're all fired because without air traffic controllers, the country just grinds to a halt because you don't have air traffic. And the same thing was happening with railroads. And so he could do nothing and let the problem continue, or he can take extreme action to stop it, but then he looks bad for that or for escalating the crisis. It's just a no-win scenario.
One of the largest unions in the country. In a gesture of conciliation, Cleveland made Labor Day a national holiday. But the Democratic Party suffered a massive blow for the panic and Cleveland's crushing of the Pullman Strike. Of course, the panic was certainly going to happen whether he or Harrison had won the election of 1892.
Right.
But after Republicans...
That's what we said. Sometimes it doesn't matter whether you're responsible or not. You still take the blame for it.
Won the election of 1896 behind William McKinley, the original framer of the McKinley Tariff. The Democrats lost power of every branch and did not win the presidency again until Woodrow Wilson in 1912. So hopefully the newly elected President Donald J. Trump does not experience a similar fate in his second term as Grover Cleveland did, with an economy that collapsed into depression just as he took office. It will be interesting to see how the next 4 years go and how the two presidents compare when all is said and done. But regardless, there are many similarities in the journeys of both U.S. presidents and many differences as well. I hope you enjoyed this look back in time at the only president to serve 2 non-consecutive terms up until this January, when Donald Trump takes office and officially becomes the second president to do so.
All right, so that was interesting. I hope you enjoyed that. Definitely gave us something to talk about, looking at Grover Cleveland's presidency, and there's a lot more we could say, obviously, about it. But if you want to check out that channel, stuff that happened, the link is down in the description to this video without my commentary, and you can check out all of his other content as well. Hope you enjoyed this. We'll see you again soon. Thanks for watching.